How do I navigate change without feeling like I've lost myself? How do I find peace in the midst of constant change? How do I feel whole when life is in transition? Friends, this is what we are chasing today. I feel the questions that are guiding this episode deeply in my own life. Thankfully, today's guest is ready to help us to navigate change. Before we dive into the conversation that was incredibly meaningful that I had with her, I'm going to highlight some of the people who write about these kinds of questions that, like our guest, have also helped me to think about change in meaningful ways. In his book, Falling Upward, Richard Rohr shares how to navigate what he calls the two halves of life. He is a Franciscan friar, and he argues that most people experience life in two main stages, which he describes as, like I said, the two halves of life. And like in the first half of life, what he is saying is that we focus on building our identity. We do this by like establishing a sense of security, success, and creating what he calls a container for our life. And this stage, he says, is necessary and it's good, but it's often limited to external achievements, our roles, and ego-driven goals. But the second half of life, he says, is marked by a deepening of spiritual understanding, where we as individuals move beyond the concerns of the first half of life. This stage often begins, unfortunately, with a crisis or a major life event that shakes our foundational beliefs, leading to what he calls falling upward, the title of his book. And it helps us to go into a more meaningful, mature spirituality. The necessity of falling is a requirement for all of us. He emphasizes that this process of falling or failing is crucial for spiritual growth. And so our moments of loss, failure, or suffering break down our ego and our ego's illusions, and they open us up to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the divine. And so for those of you who feel like you're falling, or would say something like, welcome to the second half of life. So much good can happen here. Parker Palmer, in his book, Let Your Life Speak, also offers some incredible advice for doing exactly this. The title, as it suggests, right, is all about letting our lives tell us things because they're constantly communicating, Parker says, like they're with us, revealing our truest desires, strengths, and limitations. And so he advocates for deep self-reflection, and he urges us to pay attention to our experiences, both our successes and failures, as guides to our sense of vocation, and not just our work, but the deeper call of our life. There are also novels that can support you during a time of change. The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abi Derry is a powerful novel. I loved it, about Aduni, a 14-year-old Nigerian girl with a burning desire for education and a better life. Despite being sold into marriage when she was super young and facing numerous hardships, Aduni remained determined to find her louding voice, her ability to speak up, be heard, and make her own choices. The book follows her as she navigates her journey towards empowerment and self-discovery. I also loved the poetry book, Instructions for Traveling West by Joy Sullivan. She writes, first, you must realize you're homesick for all the lives you're not living. Then you must commit to the road and the rising loneliness, to the sincere thrill of coming apart. Mid-pandemic, Sullivan left the man she planned to marry, sold her house, quit her corporate job, and drove west, all for really good reason. This compelling collection of poetry will help you to feel less alone, truly seen, and braver in the midst of change. Not unlike these incredible works, today's guest has thought deeply about change. Dr. Michaela O'Donnell is a mom of two and author of Life in Flux, Navigational Skills to Guide and Ground You in an Ever-Changing World. Thank goodness, right? She is the Mary and Dale Andringa Executive Director at Max De Pree Center for Leadership, as well as the creator and lead professor of Fuller Seminary's Doctor of Global Leadership. Redemptive Imagination in the Marketplace track. That seems like a mouthful, but basically, she's amazing. Hello, everyone. On today's episode, we have one of my bestest friends and favorite colleagues, Dr. Michaela O'Donnell. Welcome to the show.
This is so fun to be here, Angela. Thank you.
Oh, I'm really excited to dive into talking about not just your work, but specifically your new book. But I'm also excited for people to just hear you share about your reflections on life and midlife and just sort of all the things that so many of us face. So your new book is called Life in Flux.
Mm-hmm.
So all of us are feeling this, the flux, the constant flux. And basically, life in flux suggests that life is always uncertain and always changing.
Yeah.
Do you think that this is something to embrace?
Well, let me back up for a second. First of all, it's fun to be here with you, like I said. I was, before we sort of hopped on today, I was cataloging in my brain sort of the story of our friendship. And
Mm.
one of the moments that stuck out to me was when we were doing our doctoral work together. And what would happen is in our doctoral work, we'd be in these seminars and you'd be discussing something, and then inevitably you and I would want to continue the discussion afterwards. So we'd go out and everybody else would be on break. They'd be texting their people, drinking water. And you and I would be standing on the sidewalk, like with all the passion in the world, talking to each other about ideas. And then professors would come by like, are you guys okay? So that is just my precursor to say, if you and I get going, this is a long history of doing this. And so, yeah, it's what a joy it is to be here today.
Well, and
Okay.
you're
So
saying now you made me
yeah,
want to bring up something like you
do it.
all. So the thing that
Let's just tell
Michaela
stories.
was talking about is the fact that we had a professor who actually had a second class. Like every Monday, we had seminar for 3 hours with this professor. 3 hours with Dr. Mark Laubranson.
We
And
love you, Mark.
we love you, Mark. And because he knew we did this and we wanted to talk forever, he basically had a second class every Monday for another
Yeah.
2 hours and had coffee with us to talk about all the things we wanted to keep unpacking. So thank you.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay.
I
That's yeah.
mean, but that's sort of like even a lead into the topic at hand.
Yeah.
What a gift it is to have people who know you need the space to
Yeah.
unpack things
Yeah.
and intentionally create it for you. And then pretend, like I think Mark used to be like, oh, I just learned so much from you too. I want to sit and listen to you. And now, 15 years later, I'm like, Mark was busy. He did not have an extra random 2 hours in his week to do that. And the intentional choice
Yeah.
he made to sort of say, these two people are processing things and I want to provide some structure and space. So yeah, maybe that was even like our sort of initial life in flux moment, Angela. Okay, so yeah, I wrote a book with Lisa Slayton called Life in Flux, and it is rooted in a couple of things. I started writing this book. Oh, Angela, you know well how hard it is to get the thoughts on paper in the way that you're like, I want this to be clear. I started writing this and thinking about this book 3 or 4 years ago because a lot of my work at the Dupree Center for Leadership, which I'm the executive director at, which is located at Fuller Seminary, I started bumping up against all these moments of people dealing with really tough changes and needing someone to talk to and not necessarily having those structures and spaces. So I wanted to write out of this. And I got into writing and we're like leveraging a bunch of the learnings at the pre-center and some of my own dissertation work. And I felt like I was like, I need somebody who's just like been in it, in it, in it, in it. And that person for me became Lisa Slayton. She was a
Mm.
leadership coach for about 30 years, working with people in their toughest moments. So I say with all trepidation, this question of is flux, is change, is transition, is disruption, is the foggy feelings that come with it, is it something to be embraced? I think it's something to be expected. And it's something to be anticipated.
Yeah.
And I think we have choices about how we show up to that. But Angela, I mean, okay, so like back me up if you're, I mean, I know your life and my life both reflect this, but the data says that adults in the States undergo significant life transitions every 12 to 18 months.
I
Like
was
it's
lit-
happening.
I was literally going to say, hey, will you give the stat that you give in your book? I think it's 12 to 18. And all I thought when I read that was, I thought two things. One, that tracks. And two,
Tracks.
that tracks. And two, I thought, man, I feel a little bit better about my life because I felt
Right.
like, why is my life changing so drastically all the time? Like, why is it all over the place? Like, why am I all over the place? But then when I read that, I was
Yeah.
like, I guess this is like a lot of people. And when you think about it, when you think about transitions in terms of health changes, job changes, house changes, friend changes, deaths of loved ones,
Yeah.
the changes in your children's lives as they're just constantly changing.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
it's so mind blowing how, like, right, you have two little
Yeah.
ones at your
Yep.
house, little ish, we should say.
I know.
So when you think about it in that way, I know, I'm sorry.
I know.
Yeah,
I'm
I know.
But it's like sad, right? It's like
I
actually
know.
exactly what we're talking about. I'm like, oh, they're changing. And
Yeah.
you and I both
Yeah.
know this. Like, actually, people humanly and fundamentally don't resist change itself. We resist the loss that comes with change.
Yeah.
And you brought up the word already once, and I know a lot of your work is sort of thinking about this. But I think, I'm not an expert on this, but I think, and this is me like tossing it back to the rest of your thought you were going to give. I think these are ramping up around midlife. Like I feel it. I'm like,
Mhm.
okay, like they feel exponentially, whether it's the world, whether it's my world, whether it's people I love's world, the changes. I'm like 12 to 18 months, that in some ways that feels like it doesn't track because I'm like, I actually feel it kind of all the time.
Mm. I see where it's actually more than that, more often
I
than
think
that.
so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think what I was going to say is that I really love your sense that it's something to be expected. And
Mm,
so it's not necessarily something that we always welcome or that we always reject, but or that we're always resistant to, but it's like, what does it look like to be someone who lives with the expectation that things flux a lot,
yeah.
regularly in my life and in the lives of other people? How do I live from that place of expectation? Which I think your book does an incredible job of helping people to think about. Like, how do I live well with change? Before we go into some of the things that I think you offer to people that are really helpful, what are some changes that you in your own life have experienced that have taught you? In what ways has your own experiences with life in flux shaped your understanding of change? Like, how have you been changed by change?
How have you been changed by change? That's such a good question. One of the things I was thinking about as you were talking is one of the things that Lisa and I do in the book, so there's like 8 navigational skills and there's chapters and some people, depending on what's going on, it's like, oh, I really need like 3 of those and I really need like 1 of those. And so like there's a variance. But even inside of that, we do this like a common, uncommon posture thing. And we sort of lay out what the common posture is in the face of change and then what we think the deeper invitation in there. And with so much flux going on, whether it's every 12 to 18 months, whether it's the stuff that feels like it's all you or the people around you, one of the common postures that we see over and over is that we think it's our job to figure out the change, and then like to know how to respond to it. And the uncommon posture, I think the sort of deeper reflective invitation in these moments of transition, liminality, however you want to describe it, and I think there's a bunch of different interrelated ways to describe it, is that greater learning actually emerges when we can step back, gain perspective, and reflect on what to do before we jump in. And so that sense has been honestly a pretty hard one in my own life. There's all the kinds of changes from like things like that I think a lot of people are facing. Okay, the way I work is changing. I work from a computer instead of like in an office with people.
Mhm.
My husband and 2 children and we moved from Los Angeles to the Midwest a few years ago. Like you said, I've lost people that I've loved, and there's been like holes in my life. But the place that has been most formative for me personally when I think about life in flux is something very, very like close to home. So I am an only child, and my parents are divorced. They, but they did not get divorced right away. When I was 12 years old, they separated, and they did not get divorced until I was 28. So 16 years of sort of this, what might happen, what will happen, things in transition, sometimes really ebbing and flowing. I mean, I have great relationships with both of my parents. One of the big reasons my husband and I just moved back to the Midwest is to be close to them. So
Mhm.
that thing is not currently on fire for me, but it is absolutely the place of pain for me, the place of healing for me, and the place of formation when I think
Mhm.
about how to navigate disruption and change.
Mm. Mm. It's interesting. I was talking to my spiritual director at one point, and I told her a similar thing in the sense that I was like, I'm going back to a place in life that I felt like I need healing from, but like I don't want to go back to that place. I don't want to
Right.
have to work through this thing in this like this is it's like very up close how me having to work through this thing. It's interesting to me. It feels like that life brought you back to Nebraska like and so it's interesting I think how life sometimes is circular in the sense that like
Yeah.
we return back to things when maybe God, when the universe, when the world thinks we're ready to return.
Hmm.
I mean, do you sense that now you can sort of wrestle with that period of time in your life in a new way with new perspective?
Yeah, I certainly think, sort of whatever your orienting framework is, that the stars aligned there.
Yeah,
It, and my husband and I, one thing Angela, you and I have talked about a lot over the years is just like how to discern big things, how
yeah,
to know what to do, how to make changes, right? How to disrupt your own life. And
yeah,
for my husband Dan and I to leave Los Angeles and come to Nebraska was just it was a big thing. And at first, in that discernment process, that decision making process, I was like, we got to do this. We need grandparent support. We need for our kids to be. I grew up across the street from my grandmother. I want like sort of that proximity for my own children and their lives. And it took Dan a while to come to terms with that and embrace that, right? And then, really interestingly, Angela, and I don't know if I would have ever even described this to you. When he decided it was like he was ready to go, I sort of woke up to a whole bout of what was waiting for me deep underneath the surface at home that
yeah,
I was I pushing it off and didn't dealing with it. Maybe had I run away, maybe, but I think it's mostly like, okay, I'm ready to look at this stuff differently as a 40-year-old than I was as an 18-year-old who left home.
yeah,
And it took another year of just preparing myself to be able to face the feelings of going back to the place where I had the greatest nurturing relationships and so much pain. It's absolutely full circle. And then the last, 2 years have been about facing those different things one by one, right?
yeah. Yeah. And I feel like this is the hardest lesson that I'm learning and what I'm hearing if I'm hearing you correctly in this, is that we can be doing the right thing and it can create tons of fear, discomfort, anxiety. It doesn't feel good. Just because we're doing the right thing doesn't mean
Right.
right? Like, and I don't know how it took me to 41 to realize that, but it's like all of a sudden I've realized in recent months, just because I'm okay with a decision that I made or a change that has happened, just because I'm okay in the sense of like I embrace it, I expected it, I'm not resistant to it, I feel like it's the right thing to do. It doesn't mean I'm not anxious, uncomfortable, and scared to do it. So you knew this move was the right thing for your family. You knew it was what you wanted deep down, and yet it created and cultivated or nurtured, allowed for, opened up these very difficult feelings for you that you needed to wrestle with. What would you say, like, you mentioned already your book has these navigational skills, and I love this because it's about how do I move through the world as it's in flux in a way that where I don't lose myself, where I don't lose my sense of self. And so when you say navigational skills, could you talk more about like what you mean by that? And also, is there one that you think helps people when they're really uncomfortable and struggling with difficult feelings?
Yeah, great questions. I mean, first, like a little story. So my daughter is 8, and when she was about 1, we decided to put her in part-time daycare, and that was a big change, right? Becoming a mother was a giant tectonic plate shifting kind of change, and then deciding that it was time for her to start daycare on some level, and for me to go back to work. I called my mom that day and I was like, this is the worst. I felt so
Mm,
much discomfort. I felt so much anxiety. I felt so much guilt and fear, just all those like tough emotions that you're naming. So I called my
mhm,
mom, and my mom said something that like has become a check for me, like a little checkpoint in a lot of other things since. She said, Michaela, this is hard, but not wrong. It's hard, not wrong. And I'm like, yeah, okay. So that's so good, right? So just that sense of
good.
like, okay, it's hard because it's hard, not because it's wrong.
So good. Yeah. Yeah.
I know. I just like get my mom on here and get all her like little nuggets of wisdom. You know how she is.
Mhm.
Um, okay, so the navigational skill that I think is really relevant here is one that Lisa and I called check your speed. And this is birthed out of a story. A kid named Roger. Roger was a 17-year-old boy, and he grew up on the East Coast, and his family had a very modest home on the coast, like right on the shore of Maine. And Roger was the kind of kid that saved up for his first boat before he saved up for his first car. Yeah, if you could, I mean, my first car was certainly the kind that you save up for, but then it's not super reliable. That's like
Mhm.
what he had in terms of boats. And so he went one Saturday out with a couple of his good buddies, and it was like a beautiful, epically sunny day. And they went out and they were sort of, kind of going around the coast. And all of a sudden, without warning, a very dense blanket of fog rolled in. So much so that Roger literally could not see his hand in front of him. And Roger was 17 and he was out in the ocean. He was with his 3 friends. So, okay, Angela, pop quiz. I know you've read, but pretend you haven't. What kind of tool should Roger use to get back home?
He should use a jet ski to pull him. I have a funny story about that. How our boat, like my mom's boat once quit in the middle of the lake and a jet ski had to pull it in and it was just a whole thing. So go ahead. Going
Okay, a jet ski, maybe.
help
Maybe
to
yeah, he'd have to get a hold of this jet ski, call this jet ski on a phone, be able to tell this jet ski where he was, maybe with GPS. Okay, so this was 1970. There's no cell phones, there's no GPS. So the most important navigational skill was a compass and the ability to read charts. Roger
okay.
left his compass at home that day. So Roger is out there and within the fog with no technical navigational skills. And he said that the very first thing he wanted to do was like put the boat in like high gear and pedal it home, right? But he couldn't because he literally didn't know which way home was. And one thing I learned that on the coast of Maine, there is this entire alternate set of navigational tools that are entirely sound based for moments like this. So what Roger did instead was he stopped,
Mhm.
he cut the engine,
Mhm.
right? He didn't just stop, he had to cut the engine. Then he
Yep.
had to listen for signals. And Angela, he was quite literally listening for the sounds of home. Each of those bellbuoys and foghorns had different tones, signaling a different location and a different port. And he knew that if I can hear the sounds of the place that raised me, of the place of the dock that I set out today, we can make it back to safety.
Yeah.
But he was far out and he didn't know how to do that by himself. And so he and his friends would have to agree on which direction they heard the sound coming from, and then they would move incrementally forward. In the midst of fear, discomfort, anxiety, those feelings that rise to the top, it's often human instinct to power into high gear and try to move forward. The counterintuitive navigational here is actually to stop and totally cut the engine before listening for signals, right? And those signals show up in lots of different kinds of ways, depending on the environment and the type of change that's happening, and then to move incrementally forward. So that's the skill that I would sort of say this one, if we're
Mhm.
talking about the rising feelings of anxiety and discomfort and fear.
Mm. I love this so much. Just multiple layers of this idea of the sounds of home. And I do think that your book really helps us to think about what is our home? How do I be at home in no
Yeah,
matter what's going on in my life? How do I find that sense of home? But in this particular moment, I'm thinking about the sounds of home. How do I listen for home? And
yeah,
so could you say more about what does it mean to turn off the engine?
yeah.
And what does it mean to listen for the sounds of home? Like,
That's
what does that actually look like in our daily lives? And what is it, how do we listen for the sounds of home so that we're trying to go in the right direction?
such a good question. I love this question. And I love doing a variety of exercises that help people do
Mhm,
this. I won't get into all those exercises right now, but I will say that this is where, so my professional academic discipline is as a practical theologian. You know this, we share this, but I know you have a sort of wide variety of listeners here. So, practical theologian. And a lot of my theological inquiry has been about the concept of vocation. Vocation has been a word that's been largely co opted by privileged economic systems that want to equate vocation with a paid job that I love to do.
yeah.
When a
Oh,
when a right? Maybe
yeah.
that's like a
Mhm.
whole separate conversation about
Yes.
talking about getting passionate. But the root, if you go to the Christian scriptures, which is where theology ought to be extracted, in conversation with real life and what's happening in the world, right? Not just sort of in isolation. The
Mhm.
Christian scriptures demonstrate and give us a picture that vocation has a lot more to do with belonging to God than it does fulfilling a job we love. And that literally over the last 2,000 years, it morphed into that. So when I think about listening for the sounds of home, I think about listening for the sounds of my deepest sense of belonging. And this is different for different people, right? Very different. Not everybody's home that they grew up in or people that nurtured them were actually nurturing, or is that the place they think of? So this is created and or nurtured nature, all that stuff.
Mhm.
The story I told you about dropping my daughter off when I was so anxious and so uncomfortable. I don't know that I would have had the language 8 years ago to say it, but in retrospect, I would have said the thing I am doing is listening to the sounds of my belonging that I trust the most, and that
Mhm.
is my mother. So I called her on the phone and
Mhm.
said, without saying these words eloquently, calibrate the way forward for me. Help me listen for signals. Help me move incrementally forward. Help me go back to my desk for the
Mhm.
first time in a year and sit down and do something beside, change diapers and play on the floor. And that's all I need to do today. And so for
Mhm.
me in that moment, I went back to. So I encourage people, and again, there's exercises and some of the stuff in the book will take you here to be able to name your deepest sense of belonging
Mhm.
and usually to attach the faces that signal and belong there, and then to be able to tap into their wisdom, whether it's live or the scripts and mantras they've given us in these moments where we don't know if our anxiety is telling us, go, hurry, this is bad, or if it's just the natural discomfort that comes with something that's hard but not wrong.
Mm. Mm. This is so helpful. I'm feeling it a lot in my own life, and I think
Mm,
the times when I have felt like I need to leave this place or leave this relationship or make this hard decision are absolutely when I've realized I don't have a place of belonging here. And so equating
mm,
home with belonging, I think, is really helpful rather than like, a space that you grew up in, because not everyone, like you said, has that experience of home being a safe place of belonging where you grew up. But we can all, that being the deepest desire of our heart, I think is a good desire to have. That is it's a good grounding place for all of us.
yeah.
And I think that that relates a lot to, I wanted to just talk to you about this idea of, for many people that are experiencing midlife, I think that it's almost, and Richard Rohr talks about this in Falling Upward, and you note his work in your book. And they actually just did a new edition of it that Brene Brown wrote an introduction to, or a forward for, which
Mm,
is beautiful. And she writes about this idea of homesickness in her own life.
mm,
I think for a lot of us, for many of us, it's weird. We're like maybe at home more than we ever have been.
mm,
And yet longing for home, this deep sense of connection to ourselves, to others, to God, like maybe more than, I don't know, and I don't, but I've been thinking about how this happens a lot in midlife, these sorts of questions that we're talking about, and
mm.
wondering like what you might say is the sort of distinction between a midlife crisis or what Richard Rohr would say is absolutely not a crisis, is natural. I mean, I think in Falling Upward, he's saying, going from the first half of life to the second half is important. It's necessary. It's he wants that for everybody. God wants that for everybody. And so it's not a crisis. Like, how do we distinguish the difference, like, would you say, between a midlife crisis and a midlife revival?
Well, I think there's an important layer here. And yeah, like you, Richard Rohr's work for me has been very formative and impactful. And his talking about how we spend the first half of life building the container for our life and the second half deciding what ought to go in it. Right.
Yeah.
Ooh, like, what does that mean? And what if I don't like my containers? And I think this is where we want to, I want to talk about the task. And Angela, I think you and I, this is like where this, like our friendship has been such a, like, it's been one of the most formative relationships in my adult life, honestly. And
Hmm.
I think that we've observed each other and been part of each other. Yeah, right. Yeah. Like this thing I'm about to say, I'm like, yeah, this, I really feel this with you. And I feel this maybe with, a handful of people, but the work of not just defining home externally as a sense of belonging, but adding the layer and the work of coming home to ourselves.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I think that is the work of midlife. Now I'm 40, so I'm like looking at that work and I've been engaging in it for a handful of years, but not for decades, right? But there is this question of midlife that comes, and again, this is like I'll do another common uncommon posture. I think a common posture is I can play many roles, whatever job is needed to get done, I'll do that, right? When the uncommon posture is like, what is actually mine to do? There's only a few things that I'm uniquely created to inhabit, and the more I get to know myself, the more that I sort of go on that journey of life, I can distinguish between the things I ought to do and not do, and therefore not become overextended. So I am wondering, this is a question, not a statement, if the midlife revival is about, it's a really a pruning thing,
Yeah.
pruning down, right? Filling the container with things that really only we ought to be doing. And maybe one more thing, less asking what the world and others and myself want from me, and instead asking, what does the world and what do others and what do I want for me? And I think rooted in a larger context of belonging, on a bigger orienting framework of belief and spirituality, and for me, faith in God, those questions are not selfish questions, they're critical questions.
Hmm.
And the
Hmm.
self and coming home to self matters deeply.
Absolutely. And yes, and you're making me realize that it's actually at, like, no matter what stage of life our, listeners that you're in, whether you are in college, about to graduate from college, you're thinking about grad school, about marriage, you're in your late 20s, you're thinking about developing your career further, you're in midlife, you're about to retire, whatever it is. I think at multiple points of our lives, this 12 to 18 months of transition thing, and
Hmm.
there's an invitation consistently throughout our lives to ask ourselves what you had just asked, which is, what is mine to do? At
Yeah.
22, what is mine to do? At 30, what is mine to do? At 50, what is mine to do? At 75, what is mine to do? And that maybe the crisis comes, the the frustration, the angst comes when we are doing things that are not ours to do. And I think because Parker Palmer talks about this in Let Your Life Speak, this beautiful book about vocation. And from my perspective, where he's
Yeah.
just like, he's saying that burnout for him is often a
Hmm.
result of doing these things that are not even ours to do, right? And so
Yeah.
I wonder if the more that we feel revival in our lives, the more we feel good about transition and change is when we're constantly honing that sense of like we're drawn to home, we're listening to ourselves, and we're saying like, yes, this is mine to do. In my new book, I'm talking about I have this whole, and we there's a lot of where our books are aligned with each other. And because I think we're thinking about, like you said, like we think about a lot of the same stuff. We have a lot of conversations around similar questions. And one of my whole things is I was really drawn to this idea where Jesus says, like, I'm the vine and you're the branches. And like
Mm.
God's the gardener and God gets rid of the stuff that God needs to get rid of so that you can
Yeah.
flourish as a human, and I think part of like being more human, leading more into our humanity is realizing what Meister Eckhart says, which is like subtraction. Essentially, my version of Meister Eckhart is like subtraction is holy.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
you have a whole chapter dedicated to letting go. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit, maybe.
Yeah, I think yes, absolutely. Subtraction is holy and focus is good. And the question of what is mine to do stemming from the who am I and who am I not?
Yeah,
My caveat I want to give to both of us, to myself and to
please.
this conversation is, and I give this because I work with a lot of leaders, a lot of people who have an enormous amount of work power. And one of the things that we're constantly talking about is, how is this work not just for you, but for the people who, as our friend Scott Cormode would say, are entrusted to your care,
Mhm.
your neighbors down the street. Because my pause is that sort of the belief system and that bigger sense of belonging is not individual, it's collective.
Right.
And if what does it mean that I get to ask questions about what is mine to do, but some people don't get to ask those questions? And how might I utilize whatever sort of place I'm at and again, I work with leaders, so I think, we work with their work, so I think about work and leadership. How might I utilize those spaces for the good of more people being able to ask those questions, for more people being able to do the holy subtraction, for more people being able to flourish, right?
Mhm.
So, I mean, and in some ways that does take the letting go. It just takes letting go. Like, there's all kind. Lisa and I write that you find yourself in a threshold moment, usually either because of pain or possibility, right? Something happened or something might happen. And then you
Mhm.
kind of are faced with all these like questions and things. And when we are on those threshold moments, again, the instinct is to like put it in high gear and to sort of figure it out and go through it. But always, I think without question, there is a deeper invitation for growth in these moments. Who am I going to become? Who am I going to become? And I'm thinking about like now work again. Okay, like there's like a change that's happening at work, and if I sort of respond in all the ways I've always responded, I'm probably going to leave a little collateral damage in my wake, and people are going to be stressed because I'm stressed. And if instead I step back and I'm like, what's really happening? What's this anxiety that's coming up in me? How do I tether to my own sense of belonging? maybe I can, instead of reacting, respond, right? To the situation. But that takes a lot of letting go of like the habits and things that have got me here, letting go of
Mhm.
the narratives that are in my own head, letting
Mhm.
go of sort of the limiting beliefs that others have put on me or that I've put on myself about how I operate. So those threshold moments, the pain and possibility, do start a bit of a process of waking up and letting go that I think is really real. It's a whole other navigational uh, skill. But yeah, that's a tough one. That's a really tough one for me personally, Angela.
Mm. Yeah, I really love the caveat that you made. And I feel like because there's this constant balance, I think that we're trying to strive for is that like we are at home with ourselves and we care about ourselves. Like we absolutely need to. And we can't do like only live for the sake of others because then that's how burnout happens is and well, and systems cultivate. I'm really interested in, I've been thinking a lot about burnout lately, and it's really a lot of times we put the onus on the individual, like it's your
Right,
problem, your burnout, when really it's the systems around
right.
us that cultivate burnout. And I think Anne Helen Peterson and others, really note this well in their work. But and so I think we want to think more systemically about burnout rather than individually. But also like what you're saying is so important is like it's not just what is mine to do for me, but what is
That's
mine to
right.
do for the sake of human flourishing, for the sake of
That's
the
right.
community, for the sake of those who, as you said, Dr. Kermode has talked about, like for the sake of those that we serve, that we care for, that have been entrusted into our care. Rabbi Elon Babchuk, I don't know if we have
Mm-mm.
about him. He does a lot of work in the area of belonging, and he talked about how belonging is best understood in terms of thinking about the communities that have shaped us and that will come after us. And so he says he's always thinking of his life in terms of 7 generations ahead and 7 generations behind. And it was just
Wow.
like so beautiful to think and imagine about. But we're kind of dancing around this whole idea this whole time of home and stability in the midst of flux. And I'm just wondering, as we're wrapping up, if you could just speak to this idea of like, how can we be at home wherever we are? Or
Yeah.
how can I be at peace no matter what? Like, seriously, help us all. Like, is it
Well,
possible to maintain a sense of stability in the midst
yeah.
of flux?
Yeah. The word stability is interesting. I have to think more about if that's a word I want us to use, but certainly the word peace, right? I think would be important here. I think this is where preparation matters.
Mm,
I'm thinking about the story. Do you remember when the plane captain landed the plane on the Hudson River? Angela, do you remember that story?
yes.
Okay. Okay.
Terrible
So
story.
I remember how old we were, but I love this story. So like Captain
Love it.
Sully, they were like geese
There's a
that got
movie.
in one of.
That's in the movie.
No, I haven't seen the movie. I've got small kids. Am I watching movies? No, I'm watching the Great British
There's a
Bake Off to
whole
wind
there's a
down.
whole there's a whole movie, and probably listeners, if you've seen it, Dr.
Okay.
O'Donnell has been doing many other things and doesn't know. Continue.
I love it. Also, I also love being called Dr. O'Donnell by you. Dr. Angela is how you sort of are going by to
Yeah.
listeners, right? Okay. All right. All right. Sorry, I didn't call you that at the beginning.
No.
Way back, I started calling Dr. Angela on our text threads to give more preparation for these moments so that I handle it how I want to handle them. So anyway, Captain Sully, he got all the geese. If you've seen the movie, you know. If you haven't, here you go. The geese got into uh, the engine and he landed the plane on the Hudson River and
Mhm.
nobody died. And he did something that actually the great spiritual teachers teach to do, which is practice and prepare and discipline. Captain Sully's version of that was all these, sort of preparation for natural disaster. The spiritual teachers would, put forth any number of spiritual disciplines and practices and being in community. I think a very simple one. You and I are part of a like text thread with our girlfriends, a couple of our girlfriends from grad school. And that is a place that one of us will go when we need something, like, right? When
Yeah.
something happens and we're in one of these moments
Mhm.
and our capacity, I've noticed that our capacity to draw from that well is only as strong as how much has been put in it in the time leading up to when we need to go draw from the well.
Mm.
And a regular practice of texting each other, checking in on each other, being friends at a distance, then fills that up when one of us is sort of, in one of these flux moments.
Mhm.
So there's all kinds of different ways, and we put some of this in the book, of ways to sort of prepare in kind of peaceful ways. But it comes down to living the kind of rhythms that we want to come out of us in these moments.
Mm. Yeah, I've often wondered, instead of New Year's resolutions, if we instead each year would look at a sort of rhythm of life, what others have called a rule of life.
Yeah,
In the Christian monastic tradition, there's this idea of a rule of life, like, which is, these are the habits I'm going to take up, and I'm going to do these things on a daily, on a weekly, on a quarterly basis, that are going to shape my life in such a way that I can, I think, live at peace. And so I think your
yeah,
invitation is, what is my rhythm of life that creates a sense of peace? What are some rhythms, some habits I can take up? And I think as I read your book, that is what I noticed, was like, it's offering some ways of shaping your life so that no matter what's happening, whether you're in the midst, you're like right before that transition, you're in the midst of the transition, or right after, that you can have this sense of home, this sense of centeredness. So who are the people? What are the practices that I can take up that center my life? And then so I think your book gives a lot of different like opportunities, like ways of thinking about that. And that's the thing, you don't have to take you don't have to take up every navigational skill, but
right.
you don't have to take up every uncommon posture, but you could choose, I think, some of these skills, some of these postures, and say, for this season of my life, I really want to cultivate this. I'm going to focus on this particular uncommon posture. I'm going to, and I can see it really helping people to navigate change in a way that, even if they're uncomfortable, even if it's hard, feels like,
Yeah,
okay, I'm going home.
yeah. One last thing from me. We put this in the book, and then we're doing like a sort of separate piece, but we're all hardwired to come at change in different ways. Some of us are naturally wired to the present. Some of us are naturally wired to the past. Some of us are naturally wired to the future. We
Hmm.
use the Enneagram tool to sort of correlate that for people, but how we're naturally wired then
Wow. Yeah.
sort of, yeah, then it kind of impacts the specific navigational skills and or the rhythms that we want to implement in. So I'm an Enneagram 7. I'm oriented toward the future. Like I want to go. But the work actually, and it's the work that started out the conversation that you and I had today, Angela, is for me to be able to circle back to the past and to be able to listen to the pain of my past and let that and honor that instead of bypassing it as I try to move quickly toward the future. Because when I bypass it and I try to move quickly, I end up reacting instead of responding. I end up asking what other people need instead of asking what I need. But when I go back there, listen, reflect, and sort of let that guide my sense of belonging, being at peace, really changes things. So I just wanted to add that caveat that we're wired differently too, people, and
Yeah.
that certainly, yeah, dictates things.
Well, it makes me want to ask you something else, which is, what are you working on in your own life right now? I mean, like, it's one thing to write a book about life in flux, right? And
Yep.
all these different skills and postures. And like I said a moment ago, it's hard to do all of them at once. So, like, is there a particular thing in your own life that you're trying to, like, take you and Lisa's, your own advice, and say, I'm really trying to do this in my own life as a very future oriented person?
Yeah, there's like in the beginning of the book, we sort of say we identify the fruits of being able to signal that people are doing this kind of work. And one of them is just probably my life's work in terms of growing at, but it's been a major focus right now. And that is moving from reacting to responding.
Mm,
It is because I move so quickly and I go, and my brain is wired fast and I'm future oriented. I'm just
mhm.
like, react, 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 go, react, 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 go. And I'm like,
Yeah.
and I just can end up it's like that. Then I have to go back and redo things, or I miss things, or I for
Mhm.
people. So I am working, and the very, very practical thing I'm doing, Angela, is my work days are full of a lot of meetings. And for 60 seconds before every meeting that I get into, I attempt to do a body scan where I am locating the places in my body where I feel stress and
Mm.
to acknowledge it. So I go head to toe all the way down. Oh, I feel some stress right there. Over time, I get curious. What's that stress about? It helps me cultivate this reflective posture that is then woven into this difference. It teaches me to reflect before I jump in, which is that reaction versus response. So great question. That's me live.
I love it. I love it. So as you're listening right now, I invite you to think about your own life. Like, what is, one, are you more postured toward, are you more past, present, future when it comes to change and flux, right? And then what's the thing that maybe you want to think about right now in your own life that you're kind of at, just as Dr. O'Donnell was saying, like, okay, this is my thing that I'm grappling with, acting or responding versus reacting. What came up for you as you're listening to that? And then hopefully in the coming weeks, you can figure out, okay, this is the thing that I want to do to start to engage with that in a meaningful way. And I think that's something that I'm learning about myself too, is like the
Mm,
moment that I realize something about myself, it doesn't mean I have to fix it right now.
right.
It's about saying like, I, right? It's like, I don't have
I
to
just,
do
it's so real. It's like, fix it, problem fixed,
it
right?
right now. Like, notice the problem. It's about going, oh, okay, this is my tendency. This is my
Yeah.
posture.
Yeah.
This is my common posture to this thing. This is the way that I tend to deal. I see this is happening in me right now. How do
Yeah.
I notice that? Like a cup of coffee on the table and just go, okay, yeah, that's there.
Hmm.
Okay, interesting. I want to think about that more. I want to observe that thing in myself. I want to notice it more. And
Yeah.
then maybe as the days and weeks go by, go, okay, how do I, as I notice this, begin to maybe shift a little bit towards something different that might bring and cultivate more peace in our lives? I think at the end of the day, one of the things that I'm really thinking about a lot lately too is that so much of a lack of peace is not just the world in disarray, but it's my it's the way I see the world. That lack of
Yeah.
peace is within me. It's not just out there somewhere and the world's in disarray. It's that there's this lack of peace in me. And so one of the things that I'm grappling with in my own life in chapter one, just like, I mean, I hate to be like, it's really chapter one that for me was, I was like, oh, I just have to stay here. Like, forget all the other chapters. I just need to start like so that there was like this whole thing. I think it was something like I don't want to totally mess it up, but basically like the common posture is like just give me a plan and I'll do it. I need the plan. I want the common posture. And so my thing is like very that I'm realizing about myself. The thing I'm trying to observe on the table right now is I have a tendency to force my way. Like, let me
Mm,
just, if it's not working out, if I feel like things aren't going the way I want them to, it's like, I'm going to force it. I'm going to make this
yeah.
happen. And I'm just like, okay, I gotta.
Okay, so one thing I want to say there, though, this is like, we're friends. The very thing that makes you so skilled professionally, and you're so good at initiating things with friends and making things happen. It's like that is a good quality. So it's like we
Yeah,
don't want to diminish that good
that's right.
quality, but it's like how do you bring in other rhythms to sort of say what I want. I know what I usually ask from myself, and from myself is to make a plan and make it happen. What do I want for myself? I want myself to be able to take a breath and to have it sort of play out more organically. Whatever your version of that, those are small shit. And so it's like you're never gonna, and you shouldn't be. Stop. You're made so wonderfully and beautifully, and we don't want you to stop like going after it. So I think that is just something that's very real too. Is how do you read this? How do you read the common, uncommon things and not say, well, I need to be a different person, but
Right, right.
say, how do I like look at a couple things? How do I look at one thing? How do I tend to what's, causing me stress in my shoulders or making me feel like my heart's beating too fast
Mhm.
when I'm walking around the block, whatever it is.
Yeah, that's so helpful. Thank you.
Okay, I know that we're like at the risk of talking about 75 things that will have to be evaluated later, but there is a chapter in the book that I think is actually really important here, Angela, and that's
Okay.
stay in your headlights. So we just so
Mm.
often get outside of our headlights. We get outside of what ours is to do. We get outside of, like, if you think about Stephen Covey's circles of control, we get outside of what we actually can have influence on and start spinning our wheels in so many other things. And so much of the work here is, okay, what actually can I do? And to stay narrowly focused there. That's one for you and me both. I mean, knowing us both, I'm like, oh, stay in our headlights. You
Yeah,
and I
that's
could
so
just
true.
have a friend combo about that.
Yeah, yeah, that's so true.
Yeah,
Specifically, you've given people just like a lot of food for thought. But then I can imagine listeners saying, but I have no time to think about the stuff that you're talking about. Like, I don't have I don't have time to reflect, to figure out this stuff. To, you know what I mean? To go
yeah,
inward.
yeah,
To listen for the sounds of home. I don't have time to cut off the engine. I don't have
yeah,
time for any of this. Like, I would love this kind of time. That sounds nice. You know, what
yeah.
would you say to them?
Well, I empathize here, right? As a busy professional who travels a lot and has two
Yeah.
children and has a wide social network and has, however many people who report up to me. And so I want to name all that and say, like it's got to be priority. Like, and the cost benefit analysis here is just cannot be understated. I want to go back to your statement. This is like on the most simple of levels. Like every Thursday, I unsubscribe from email lists. It's like, how do I just like clear a little space?
Yeah.
How do I put my kid in one after school activity, not three or four? How do I have better boundaries with my phone from the hours of, 5 until 8, and exposing myself, to conversations that I want to have instead? So there are some small mechanisms that are actually there. And so maybe the encouragement there is to start with being like little itty bitty things that help you be present to your own life, to be present to
Mhm.
the things that are inside of you, to be present to the feelings that are coming up in the midst of disruption. Because it's like, my husband and I have a rule. It's like exactly when you feel the most on the edge of crazy work stuff, it's like that's when it's time for a vacation. Not after the things are due,
Oh,
but
it's so
before. Like, and that's
yeah.
in our pattern. It's like when my dissertation was due, we went on a trip 2 weeks earlier. So I'm like, it's just, I got to right size the priority. So I say that as a person who really has to daily work on what you just said, Angela, and I'm not perfect at it, but the fruit of it shows up in my relationships. It shows
Yep.
up in my inner being. It shows up in my noticing what I need to take to a therapist or an executive coach. So the fruit of it, and then you start seeing the fruit of it, and then you start making more space for it, right?
Oh,
And so
so
that
good.
that happens.
Right, because yeah, absolutely. And so what I hear you saying, you talk about taking water out of the boat. Like, I've heard this, I don't know if this is in this book, and I've heard you talk about it other places, or
Yeah,
but it's both. Okay. Yeah. Sometimes you're like, wait, do I just know this because you've said it somewhere else? But like, yeah. So you're saying, if the boat is drowning, the boat is taking on so much water that it's sinking, and so you're like, oh, I can't do anything else, then you got to take water out of the boat. Like, it's not a matter of, oh, I just can't do this for myself. I can't listen for the sounds of home. I can't, create this space. It's that if you don't, the boat will sink.
yeah.
Something
It's
like you'll
mission
just, you're
critical.
yeah, it becomes critical. Exactly. And so I love these little ways that you have described where you can take water out of the boat, so to speak, as you say. And the more that you do that, the more you go, that feels different. That feels
Yeah,
lighter. Wow,
yeah,
I'm okay. That feels like I'm able to move through life in a different kind of way where all of a sudden that peace wells up within you.
yeah,
And yeah, even in the midst of hard things. Yeah.
yeah. We go through our lives. This is another my mom wisdom. We go through
Mhm.
our lives taking on we're all little boats in this analogy, and we
Mhm.
go through our lives basically taking on water. And unless we intentionally let water off the boat, we're going to drown. And for all of us, we let water off the boat different. I often have people start with making a list. Where are you taking on water? Look at your calendar from last week. And then to make a separate list. What helps you let water off the boat, which is different than the mindful, reflective practices that I've been naming. Letting water off the boat is, for me, is dance party with my kids, run around the block, those kind of things that are just like, I need to level set my heart and brain back to like functioning. And then it's like, okay, how do I reflect more? So this is
Mm-hmm.
exponential work. And this is your work, Angela, in a world that tells us always to be on. This is now subversive activity. This
Yeah.
is subversive, countercultural choices to live in peace and not in anxiety and chaos.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thanks to everyone who's listening with us. It's been awesome to talk with you. Life in Flux, available everywhere that books are sold.